Frozen bear pleads for shelter. What happens next leaves everyone stunned. The wind howled across the frozen treetops, dragging fine snow like sand over the icy ground, polishing the world in white silence. Inside a small log cabin buried in the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, Samuel Reed sat by the fire. The only movement in the room, the flicker of orange light dancing across his weathered face. The flames hissed softly, swallowing the cold one crackle at a time. Beside him, stretched across the worn wooden floor, lay Ranger, his German shepherd, whose ears flicked now and then toward the door, always alert. The storm outside was the kind that swallowed sound, swallowed thought. It was the kind of storm Samuel had once feared, back when survival still mattered to him, back when he had something to lose. But those years were gone. His wife Emma and daughter Lily had been taken by a different kind of storm, one that arrived quietly and never left. Cancer didn't howl like wind. It crept in, it stole warmth, it left him with silence. And now he lived in that silence. By choice, the nearest town was hours away, and he hadn't been there in months. Supplies were stocked. Wood was chopped. No one visited. He liked it that way. Outside, the snow thickened, and the wind surged harder against the cabin walls, like the fists of a ghost trying to get in. Samuel reached for his coffee mug, black, bitter, almost cold, but paused when Ranger suddenly stood. His ears perked. He faced the door. A low growl vibrated in his throat, not hostile, but uncertain. Samuel narrowed his eyes. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, setting the mug down slowly. Ranger stepped forward, nose twitching, body taut. Then a sound, a faint scrape against the door. Not the wind, not a branch, something heavier. Samuel rose, his joints stiff from hours by the fire. He pulled on his parka, grabbed the rifle from above the mantel, and moved cautiously to the door. Ranger stood beside him, tense but silent now. Samuel cracked the door open just an inch and froze. A massive shadow loomed just outside, half buried in snow, its breath visible in great, slow puffs. The bear's eyes met his through the gap, dull and weary, not wild with aggression. A grizzly, huge, injured, and alone. Samuel's first instinct was to slam the door shut. His second was to fire a warning shot, but he did neither. Something in the bear's gaze rooted him in place. It didn't move. It didn't growl. It simply stood, or tried to. Its legs trembled. Blood, dark and half frozen, stained the fur along its flank. Then it slumped forward, collapsing into the snow with a sound that was more resignation than pain. Samuel stood for a moment, rifle grip tight, heart pounding. Ranger let out a quiet whine. The bear didn't move. Slowly, Samuel opened the door wider. Cold burst inside, swirling snow at his feet. Ranger stepped forward, tail low, nose twitching madly. The bear's massive head lifted slightly. No teeth, no threat, just exhaustion. Just trust? "This is insane," Samuel muttered under his breath. But he moved forward anyway, boots crunching through the snow, heart racing. He knelt a few feet from the beast, rifle slung over his shoulder now. Closer, he could see to the wound, a gash across the bear's side, likely from a fight. There were scratches along her back, signs of a struggle. She was breathing hard, but slow. "You shouldn't be here," Samuel whispered, not really expecting an answer. "You should have died out there. Why'd you come to me?" The bear blinked slowly, her body unmoving except for the rise and fall of her labored breath. Samuel looked back at Ranger, who stood at the doorway, unsure but not aggressive. That was strange. Ranger was trained to guard, to protect. And yet, here he was, calm, watching, waiting. Samuel turned back to the bear and made his decision he didn't fully understand. "All right," he said under his breath, "but if you try anything, that's it." He disappeared back into the cabin for a moment and returned with an old tarp. Working carefully, grunting from the cold and effort, he managed to wrap the tarp around the bear's massive shoulders and tug, just enough to drag her out of the worst of the wind and under the shelter of the overhanging roof. She didn't resist, didn't growl. She simply let him. He poured a bowl of water and set it near her mouth. She sniffed it, then drank, slow and deliberate. "You're not just tired," he said aloud. "You're wounded, hungry, but something else." He shook his head. Why here? Why now? Back inside the cabin, Samuel built the fire higher and placed another blanket near the hearth. Ranger paced near the door, occasionally glancing at Samuel with uncertain eyes. Yeah, I know, Samuel said. This is a damn fool thing to do. He checked the rifle, just in case. Then, after a few minutes, he cracked the door again. The bear had barely moved. Snow was piling around her. He couldn't leave her there, not after she came this far. And not with that look in her eyes. So for the first time in years, Samuel opened his home to more than just his dog. Using all his strength and a wooden sled from the shed, he hauled the bear the last few feet inside, clearing a space near the corner farthest from the fire. Ranger stayed near the hearth, tense but silent. The bear's bulk filled the room with a new weight, something ancient and wild. She didn't move much, just curled slightly, the tarp still wrapped around her. Samuel crouched beside her, studying the wound. It was deep, but not fresh. Days old, maybe? Infection hadn't set in, but it might. He retrieved an old medical kit and, with hands steadier than he expected, cleaned the wound and packed it with salve. She winced once, but made no move to swipe at him. Just watched. Just trusted. That night, the storm roared louder, but inside, the cabin pulsed with an odd sense of calm. Ranger eventually settled, still watching, but no longer growling. Samuel sat in his old chair, staring at the bear in the corner, then at Ranger, then at the fire. For years, he'd lived alone because the world had taken everything from him, and now here he was, sheltering a wounded predator in his cabin, listening to the storm together like old companions. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow. Maybe she'd leave. Maybe she'd die. Maybe she'd turn on him. But something told him deep, inexplicably, that she wouldn't. That this moment, strange as it was, meant something. Samuel leaned back, the firelight warm on his face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt the silence wasn't quite so empty anymore. The sun never truly rose during those bleak winter days, only smudged the horizon with a dim gray light that bled through the clouds. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with warmth and breath, a strange blend of wood smoke, dog fur, and something older, something wild. The bear still lay in the far corner, her flanks slowly rising and falling. Her eyes opened now and then, alert but unthreatening, watching Ranger and Samuel with the wary caution of a creature caught between two worlds. Ranger had stopped pacing. He now sat near the fire, ears flicking occasionally toward the bear, but otherwise calm. Samuel noted this silently. It was unnatural, this calm between dog and bear, predator and protector. But then again, nothing about this past day had been natural. Samuel moved quietly around the cabin, preparing a stew from dried venison and root vegetables, his hands moving with a kind of mechanical efficiency. He glanced toward the bear. She hadn't eaten. He didn't expect her to eat what he ate, but she hadn't refused the water either. That meant something. He dipped a tin bowl into the stew and set it aside, then opened a container of frozen fish he'd caught and preserved weeks ago. He warmed a few over the stove and placed them carefully on a metal tray. When he set it near the bear, she sniffed cautiously before dragging herself up just enough to eat. Her teeth, large and yellowed, worked through the soft flesh with slow determination. Samuel stood at a distance watching. "That's it," he murmured. "Get your strength back." She ate everything, then lowered her head again, and for a long time there was only the sound of fire and the wind pressing against the cabin walls. The following morning, Ranger's behavior changed. He stood by the door, pawing lightly, nose against the wood. Not alarmed, focused. Samuel noticed. "What is it?" he asked. Ranger looked back at him, gave a short, insistent whine, and pawed the door again. The bear stirred at the noise, lifting her massive head, eyes following Ranger's movements. Samuel set his mug down and crossed to the door, pulling on his coat and boots. "You want out?" he asked, opening the door just a crack. The cold hit him like a slap, and snow, deep and dry, blew in swirls around his legs. Ranger stepped forward, tail low, ears alert. He looked back at Samuel, then darted outside. "Ranger!" Samuel called, stepping out behind him. The bear let out a sound, low, guttural, not a growl, but something anxious. Samuel hesitated, then turned back inside, grabbed his rifle, and followed Ranger into the storm. The snow was thick, blinding in places, the kind that clung to his beard and crusted on his lashes. Ranger moved quickly, nose low to the ground, weaving through trees. Samuel kept up as best he could, heart pounding from cold and urgency. Something was guiding the dog, some scent, some instinct. After nearly 20 minutes, they reached a half-fallen spruce tree, its trunk broken and buried in a drift. Ranger stopped, circled, then began to dig furiously. Samuel dropped to his knees beside him. "What are you after, boy?" he asked, brushing away snow. Then he saw it, a small paw, tiny, still, his breath caught. "Oh no." He dug faster, scooping snow away until he uncovered the small, shivering form of a cub, a bear cub, barely breathing, eyes closed, sides rising and falling in faint spasms. "God," he whispered, "there's more of them." He carefully scooped the cub into his arms, wrapping it in the folds of his coat. The cub made a soft, pitiful sound, like a whimper. Ranger licked its snout once, gently. Samuel held it close, his own body heat the only thing he could offer. "Let's go," he said, rising to his feet, heart racing. "We have to move fast." The return to the cabin was harder. The snow seemed deeper, the wind sharper, and Samuel's legs burned with every step. But he never loosened his grip on the tiny creature clutched to his chest. When they finally reached the door, he kicked it open with a burst of urgency, and the bear, still lying in the corner, lifted her head sharply, eyes wide. The moment she saw the cub in Samuel's arms, a deep moan escaped her throat. She tried to rise, but her body failed her. Samuel moved fast, clearing space near her and laying the cub down on a bed of blankets beside her massive paws. The mother bear nosed the cub gently, licking its fur. Her breathing ragged but filled with emotion Samuel could feel vibrating in the air. He stood back, watching the reunion unfold, chest heaving, heart thudding. Ranger lay down quietly by the door, tail sweeping the floor once. It didn't end there. The next day, Ranger insisted on going out again. Samuel followed, skeptical but trusting now. And again, they found another cub, this one deeper in the woods, beneath a rock outcrop, shivering and too weak to cry out. The second rescue went faster, but not easier. The storm had eased, but the cold still bit deep, and Samuel's shoulders ached from strain. But by the end of this day, both cubs lay curled beside their mother, nestled into her thick fur, their tiny bodies drawing strength from her warmth. Samuel tended to them all, cleaning, feeding, creating a space where wildness could rest without fear. The cabin, once a place of cold memories and silence, now pulsed with breath and life. In the quiet hours, Samuel found himself talking. To Ranger, to the bears, to himself. "You're tougher than I thought," he'd say while dabbing a salve on the mother bear's side. "Must have fought off something big. Wolves, maybe. But you made it. You made it to me." Sometimes he'd talk to Lily, to Emma. Their names had gone unused for so long they felt foreign in his mouth. But now they came easily, carried on the air like prayers. "You'd like this, Lil," he murmured one night. "She's got cubs. Like little stuffed animals with claws. You'd have wanted to name them." The memories didn't burn the same way anymore. They ached, yes, but the ache had softened, stretched by something new, a sense of purpose, of presence. Something in this strange companionship had cracked the walls around his grief. Even Ranger seemed changed. He no longer hovered at Samuel's side, but spent hours curled near the cubs, eyes always watchful. Once the mother bear lifted her head and gently nosed the dog's shoulder, a moment that nearly brought Samuel to tears. There was a truce between them all now, a quiet agreement born not of logic but necessity and trust. Samuel kept the fire going, cooked more than he needed, and even carved out a space in the cabin's back wall to create a temporary pen for the cubs as they grew stronger. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd done for anyone in years. And somewhere between the firelight and the snowstorms, Samuel began to feel awake again, not happy, not whole, but present. He had gone so long without that feeling that he almost didn't recognize it. Each breath from the cubs, each slow blink from the mother bear, each glance from Ranger, they all chipped away at something frozen inside him. One night as the cubs slept, Samuel sat near the fire, a mug of tea in hand, and whispered into the room, "You brought them to me, didn't you? You walked through a storm to this place. How did you know I wouldn't turn you away?" The bear didn't answer, but she looked at him for a long time, her golden eyes catching the firelight. And in that silence, Samuel felt the reply settle into his bones like warmth. The days bled into each other beneath the heavy sky. each one slightly longer. The light outside lasting just a few minutes more than the last. Spring was still a distant promise, but the worst of winter had loosened its grip, and inside the cabin, the rhythm of life had taken on a quiet, remarkable steadiness. The bear's wounds had scabbed over, no longer oozing, and her eyes held more alertness than before. The cubs were stronger now, their movements more playful, their soft growls echoing against the wooden walls as they wrestled one another or curled close to their mother. Samuel found himself watching them often, sometimes from across the room, sometimes from the edge of his armchair by the fire, sometimes while pretending to busy himself with some chore, yet always with a gaze that softened his normally hard features. Ranger, once the ever-vigilant guardian of the cabin, had become something of a sentinel for the cubs. He lay beside them at times, allowing the smaller ones to paw at his ears or climb over his back, and though he would let out a huff when they got too bold, he never snapped or turned away. Samuel had laughed once, an honest, unguarded laugh, when one of the cubs pulled at Ranger's tail, and the brighten, with great theatrical patience, simply shifted slightly and gave the cub a long-suffering look. It had been so long since laughter had come to him naturally, it felt strange in his throat, and yet, when it passed, it didn't vanish completely. Something lingered. The days settled into a rhythm. Samuel cooked larger meals to accommodate his wild guests, boiling fish and venison scraps into soft stews the bears could eat. He rationed supplies with careful calculation, knowing his winter stockpile was never meant to feed a family of 5. But he didn't mind. When he stepped outside to fetch more wood or check his snares, the cold still bit at his skin, but his heart no longer clenched with that old familiar ache. The snow was still deep, but it no longer looked like a grave. It looked like a beginning. One morning after feeding the cubs and checking the mother's bandages, though by now she hardly needed them, Samuel sat near the fire with a tin mug of coffee in his hands and spoke aloud without meaning to. "I thought I'd buried everything worth saving," he murmured. "Turns out some things dig their way back to you." The bear lifted her head slightly, her breath steaming in the warm air. Samuel smiled, not at the response, but at the absurdity of it all. A widowed man in the wilderness, speaking to a grizzly bear like an old friend. But it didn't feel absurd. It felt real. That night, Samuel dreamed of his daughter. Lily stood in the snow, bundled in the little red coat she used to wear when they visited Denali together. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her smile wide as she reached for his hand. "Daddy, look," she said, pointing toward the trees. And when Samuel turned, he saw the bear and her cubs walking through the falling snow, Ranger at their side like a guardian. Lily's voice came again, softer now. "You don't have to be alone anymore." He woke with tears in his eyes and didn't wipe them away. The following morning, Samuel noticed the bears beginning to stir differently. The mother, once content to lie still for hours, now paced slowly across the room, testing her limbs, watching the door. The cubs followed her movements with bright eyes, mimicking her steps, sniffing at the edges of the room as though sensing the pull of the wild again. Even Ranger seemed to sense it. He sat straighter, eyes following the bear family with an unspoken understanding. Samuel watched it all unfold, the way things sometimes do when their end is near, not with a bang or dramatic parting, but with a gradual shifting, a natural conclusion. And yet, when the day came, when the mother bear stood before the door and looked at Samuel, not with pain or fear, but with readiness, a heaviness settled in his chest. He opened the door and stepped aside, and snowflakes drifted in, dancing in the morning light. The bear stepped forward, sniffed the air, then looked back at her cubs. One by one they followed her, their bodies stronger, rounder, ready. She turned once more toward Samuel, and for a moment he imagined he saw something in her eyes, something deep and wordless, like gratitude. Then she walked out into the snow, her cubs tumbling after her, disappearing into the trees like a fading memory. Samuel stood in the open doorway long after they were gone, the cold forgotten, the silence now different. Ranger came to his side and sat, leaning slightly against his leg. "Well, take this," Samuel said, voice hoarse. "I guess that's that." But it wasn't. 2 days later, just after dusk, a strange sound cut through the quiet. Ranger, lying beside the hearth, sprang to his feet, ears sharp. Samuel put down his carving knife and stood. The sound came again, a series of huffs, almost frantic, from the edge of the woods. Samuel opened the door to find the mother bear once more, pacing at the tree line, her breath coming in short clouds. She turned and moved a few paces, then stopped, looked back. Samuel's heart sank. Something was wrong. He grabbed his coat, his rifle, and followed. Ranger ran ahead, the bear leading them into the darkness beneath the trees. It didn't take long. The third cub, the smallest, had somehow been separated from the others. It lay trapped in a drift near a half-collapsed snowbank, limbs barely moving. Samuel didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees, digging with gloved hands until he reached the cub's trembling body. He pulled it free, cradling it close. The cub let out a faint whimper, and Samuel wrapped it tighter in his coat. The mother bear stood nearby, watching, her whole frame tense with worry. Ranger circled protectively. They made the trek back together, this strange family in the dark. Back at the cabin, Samuel revived the cub near the fire, fed it drops of broth, held it against his chest until it stopped shaking. The mother lay beside it that night, licking its fur, humming deep sounds of comfort that filled the cabin like a lullaby. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, Ranger's head on his boot, and stared at the soft, slow breathing of the cubs. He had saved lives, lives that, by every measure, should have had nothing to do with his own. Yet here they were, and here he was, not a broken man anymore, not just a shadow. In reaching out to heal them, something inside him had healed too, like old scar tissue softened by warmth and time. He whispered into the fire, "Maybe I needed saving too." The days settled into a rhythm. Samuel cooked larger meals to accommodate his wild guests, boiling fish and venison scraps into soft stews the bears could eat. He rationed supplies with careful calculation, knowing his winter stockpile was never meant to feed a family of 5. But he didn't mind. When he stepped outside to fetch more wood or check his snares, the cold still bit at his skin, but his heart no longer clenched with that old familiar ache. The snow was still deep, but it no longer looked like a grave. It looked like a beginning. One morning, after feeding the cubs and checking the mother's bandages, though by now she hardly needed them, Samuel sat near the fire with a tin mug of coffee in his hands and spoke aloud without meaning to. "I thought I'd buried everything worth saving," he said quietly, voice raw in the silence. "But maybe it was just sleeping." The bear looked up at him from across the room, her eyes calm, ancient, and knowing. Ranger lay curled nearby, one paw twitching in his sleep, and one of the cubs let out a tiny snore. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel like a place of exile. It felt like a home. Outside, the wind had changed. It no longer howled with teeth, but whispered like an old friend. The icicles that hung from the roof dripped slow and steady, and patches of brown earth began to peek through the snow at the base of the trees. Samuel knew it wouldn't last, not yet, but it was a sign. The bears seemed to feel it too. The mother had begun to move more, pacing the room in slow circles, stretching her limbs with stiff, deliberate motions. The cubs grew bolder each day, climbing onto the low shelves, knocking over pots, and even chewing through one of Samuel's gloves. He found himself grumbling, but without anger. In fact, there was a strange joy in it, this controlled chaos, this disruption of his long-held quiet. At night, the bears would curl near the fire, while Ranger kept his spot by Samuel's feet. The man who had once built a life of silence now lived in a den of breath and warmth and movement. It frightened him how much it had changed him already. Then, on the cusp of dawn one morning, Samuel opened the door and stood on the porch, staring into the pale gray woods. The bear came to stand beside him, massive and silent. She had not come this close before, not since the night she arrived. Now she stood just behind him, breathing evenly, her cubs watching from inside. Samuel turned slowly, his hand resting instinctively on the rifle slung across his shoulder, but the bear didn't move. She met his gaze with something deeper than instinct, something that felt like understanding. Then she stepped out into the snow. Not far, just a few paces. She turned, looked back, and waited. Samuel hesitated. Then Ranger moved beside him, ears forward, body alert but calm. Together, they followed. The bear led them through the trees, her pace slow enough for Samuel to keep up, her steps careful and sure. The path wound deeper into the forest, past the frozen stream and the rock face that Samuel usually avoided. It was a place of memory. He and Emma used to hike there with Lily when the girl was small, before everything went dark. He hadn't been back since, but today he didn't turn away. The bear paused near a drift of snow piled against the base of a tree. She sniffed the air, then looked at Samuel. Ranger darted forward and began to dig. Samuel stepped up beside him, already feeling dread stir in his chest. Not another one, he thought. Not another cub. But that's exactly what it was, a third smaller cub, barely alive, its body half buried in the snow. The weak rise and fall of its chest was the only sign it hadn't already been claimed by the cold. "Oh God," Samuel whispered, dropping to his knees. The bear paced nearby, agitated but patient. Samuel scooped the cub into his arms, tucking it beneath his coat, cradling it to his chest. It was so light, too light. "We have to move," he said, rising. Ranger led the way back, moving faster than before, and the bear followed close behind. Back at the cabin, the fire was stoked high, and blankets were warmed as Samuel worked quickly to revive the cub. He wrapped it in wool, fed it broth with a spoon, and pressed it to his own skin to transfer warmth. The mother bear watched closely, her huge body trembling with silent worry. The other cubs sniffed at their sibling, letting out soft whines, but Samuel kept them back. The hours stretched. Samuel barely blinked. He poured warmth and breath and desperate care into that tiny form. And just before dusk, the cub stirred. A twitch, a gap, a slow opening of its eyes. Samuel exhaled so deeply he felt his soul shake loose. The mother bear let out a low rumble of relief and lowered her head, nosing the cub gently. The siblings huddled close again, and Samuel stepped back, arms shaking, heart overflowing. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, Ranger beside him, the bears nestled in the corner. He watched them breathe, watched them sleep, and he thought about what had brought them to him, what had pushed a mother bear to risk everything, to trust a man, to walk into a stranger's firelight. He thought about the years he'd spent building walls, how grief had turned his love into silence. And now here he was, broken open by a creature of the wild, by her cubs, by the snow, by the fire. It wasn't lost on him that he had been the one to rescue that last cub, but perhaps it was that cub who had rescued him. A final piece falling into place, a final chance to choose life again. As the fire cracked and shadows danced along the walls, Samuel closed his eyes and saw Lily's face, not in pain, not in memory, but laughing. Laughing with walled abandon, the way she used to in the woods, chasing Ranger through the brush, falling into Emma's arms. The memory didn't make him flinch anymore. It made him smile. There would always be an ache, always a scar, but healing wasn't forgetting. Healing was remembering without breaking. And in the soft rhythm of breathing, dog and bears and man, Samuel knew that his heart, long buried in winter, yada, had begun to thaw. Spring came quietly, not with fanfare, but in subtle shifts. A slower melt, a bird call in the early morning, the scent of damp earth seeping up through the snow. The cabin, once buried under a blanket of white, began to emerge again. The roof, the porch, the path to the woodshed had all slowly freed themselves from winter's grip, and where once there was only silence, now came the gentle drip, drip, drip of thaw. Samuel noticed it first in the sounds, the creaking trees no longer stiff with frost, the wind brushing through softening branches, the rustle of something alive beneath the snow. The forest was waking up, and with it, so was he. Inside, the air felt lighter. The bears were stronger now, their eyes sharper, their muscles fuller. The cubs wrestled more each day, tumbling over each other like soft brown shadows. They played tug-of-war with Samuel's old socks, climbed onto his workbench, knocked over tins, and chewed on the edges of his boots. And instead of grumbling, Samuel laughed. Every time. The mother bear had nearly made a full recovery. Her wounds, once raw and angry, had faded into healing scars. She moved with ease now, often pacing near the windows, sniffing the air as if remembering something. Something ancient, something calling her home. Ranger sensed it too. He no longer followed the cubs so closely, no longer guarded their every move. Instead, he spent more time beside Samuel, watching, listening, waiting. And then one morning, she stood by the door. Not pacing, not anxious, just ready. Samuel opened it for her. She stepped outside into the soft snow, blinking at the light. One by one, the cubs followed, each pausing for a brief moment, as if imprinting the memory of the place. Samuel stood on the porch, hand resting on the railing. Ranger beside him. The bears moved slowly into the clearing, then stopped. The mother turned her massive head and looked back at him. Not briefly, not by accident, but fully, as though saying something without the burden of language. Her eyes held something that pierced straight through the last layers of frost inside him. Respect, trust, gratitude, and something like farewell. Samuel nodded once, hand lifting in a quiet gesture. Then they were gone, into the trees, into the wild that had shaped them. For a long time, Samuel didn't move. The forest stood still. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if to honor their departure. Ranger sat beside him, eyes fixed on the spot where they'd disappeared. The cabin behind them felt empty in a way it hadn't for weeks, but it wasn't a painful emptiness. It was peaceful. A chapter closed. Samuel stepped back inside, let the door fall shut behind him, and stood in the middle of the room. There were scratches on the floor, bare fur clinging to the corners, broken tools and missing gloves. Signs of life, of wildness, of healing. He smiled to himself and began to clean, not out of duty, but out of care. He kept a few things untouched. A small paw print pressed into a dried mud patch by the door, a tiny bite-marked cup one cub had claimed as a toy, and a rough piece of driftwood he carved into the shape of a mother bear and 3 cubs. It sat by the windowsill, catching the afternoon light. The days that followed were quiet, but never again did they feel like isolation. The forest no longer loomed outside like a wall, but opened itself up like a companion. Samuel started walking more, venturing farther each day. He cleared old trails, fixed a crumbling bridge over the creek, even built a new bench beneath the spruce where Lily used to sit and whistle through her fingers. Sometimes he spoke aloud, to her, to Emma, to the trees, to the silence itself. And sometimes the silence answered, not with words, but with moments. A moose crossing the stream without fear, a fox watching from the ridge, Ranger napping beneath the sun, belly up. The moments stacked quietly, like stones, building something solid beneath his feet. One morning as he was trimming branches near the path, Ranger barked sharply. Samuel turned and saw her. The mother bear, just beyond the tree line, alone. She didn't come closer this time. She just stood there, watching. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just lifted a hand, and after a long moment, she turned and vanished again into the green. That was the last time he saw her. He never expected her to return, but he knew she might, and whether she did or didn't matter. What mattered was that she had come at all. Weeks passed, the ice vanished from the creek. The grass grew tall and stubborn. The birds came back, loud and clumsy in their songs. Samuel rebuilt the garden bed behind the cabin. He hadn't planted anything in years, but this time he made space for wildflowers, for color, for joy. Sometimes hikers passed through, rare and distant, and he waved instead of hiding. When they asked if this was where the ranger used to live, he nodded and said, "Still does." At night, he sat on the porch with Ranger, staring into the trees. The shadows no longer scared him. The darkness no longer weighed. In that final thaw, something had broken loose in him, something he'd held too tightly for too long. Grief didn't vanish, but it softened, bent at the edges. It let the light through. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and painted the sky in amber and lavender, Samuel stood beside the carved wood figure on the windowsill. He picked it up, turned it in his hands. Mother, 3 cubs. Beneath it, he etched one word slowly, carefully, with the tip of his knife. Home. Then he set it back down. Behind him, Ranger sighed and stretched. The forest outside shifted with wind and bird song and life. And Samuel Reed, once a man buried in silence, stood in the warmth of his cabin, heart whole in a way it hadn't been for years. He reached for the door, opened it, and stepped out barefoot onto the soft grass. The earth was cold, but alive. The wind brushed past him, not as a ghost, but as a breath. He raised his face to the sky and whispered, "Thank you." And though no one answered, he felt deeply that someone had heard. Gentle Bear leads Rangers to Injured Hiker. What happens after rescue will amaze you. The morning air clung to the mossy bones of the forest, damp and laced with the scent of rain that had not yet fallen. In Evergreen National Park, nestled in the wilds of the Pacific Northwest, spring arrived like a cautious visitor, testing the air with gentle breezes in the occasional blossom, but unwilling to fully dislodge winter's lingering chill. Ranger Jack Emerson stood on the porch of his weathered cabin, tin mug in hand, steam curling from his coffee like the breath of the mountains themselves. At 62, Jack was a man shaped by solitude and the quiet rhythms of nature. His face was as creased as the bark of the towering cedars behind him, his hands calloused and firm from years of gripping hiking poles and radio dials. He had spent decades walking this land, watching its seasons shift like pages in a book only he could read. And yet, for all that familiarity, something felt wrong. It was the second morning in a row she'd appeared. A black bear, young but grown, large enough to command caution, stood motionless just beyond the tree line. She wasn't foraging. She wasn't passing through. She was watching. Jack lowered his mug slowly, every instinct in his body alert. The bear's dark eyes were fixed on him, not with hunger, not with fear, but with something that unnerved him more deeply: awareness. The wind moved through the trees, stirring the scent of pine and wet stone, and still she stood. Then, as if by cue, she turned and vanished into the brush. The first time he'd seen her, he'd chalked it up to coincidence. Perhaps she was simply lost or curious. But the second morning, and then the third, this was not coincidence. On the third day, when she came again, early in the pale hush just before sunrise, Jack was already waiting. She emerged from the forest with the same deliberate calm, her black fur silvered by dew, her breath misting in the crisp air. Jack stepped off his porch, moving slowly, his boots crunching the frost-hardened ground. He didn't speak. He simply watched her, and she watched him, something old and unspoken passing between them, like wind between trees. And then, without warning, she turned and walked into the forest. Jack followed. He didn't pack a full kit, just a first aid pouch, his radio, a flask of water, and a thermos of coffee. He didn't know what he expected to find, but some quiet part of him knew that if he ignored this, if he stayed behind, he would regret it for the rest of his life. She moved fast but not far ahead, keeping within sight, pausing every so often to glance back. The terrain grew steep, rugged, the trail long since surrendered to time. Jack pushed past ferns as tall as his chest and ducked beneath moss-laden limbs. He knew these woods, at least he thought he did, but this felt different, like stepping into someone else's dream. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher behind a thin veil of cloud. The forest narrowed into a ravine, steep-walled and cold. Jack hesitated at the edge of a ridge, heart pounding with exertion and something deeper, older. Luna, he didn't know when the name had come to him, but it felt right, stood at the crest, staring down into the gorge below. When Jack reached her side, she took one long look into his eyes and then disappeared into the underbrush, leaving him alone with the silence. He looked down and froze. Below, tangled in the shadows and pine needles, lay the body of a man. Jack's training took over before the shock could sink in. He scrambled down the slope, his boots slipping on wet rock. The man was unconscious, barely breathing, one arm twisted unnaturally beneath him. Jack dropped to his knees and checked for a pulse, faint, but there. Frostbite was evident on his fingertips, and dried blood matted the hair at his temple. The radio on Jack's belt crackled as he called for medevac assistance, giving coordinates with clinical precision. But his mind reeled. Who was this man? How had he gotten here? The chopper arrived hours later, the thud of its blades scattering birds into the sky. Paramedics loaded the man into a stretcher, faces grim as they assessed his condition. Jack stayed behind, staring at the ridge. Luna was gone. Not a twig stirred. He felt the weight of her absence like a closing door. The hospital in the nearby town of Clearwater was small but efficient. Jack visited 2 days later, half expecting to find the bed empty. But the man, Ethan Cole, was still there, pale and bruised, his arm in a cast, IV trailing from his hand. Jack introduced himself. Ethan smiled weakly. "Ranger," he rasped, voice raw from dehydration. "I owe you everything." Jack shook his head. Don't thank me. Thank the bear. Ethan blinked, then his eyes welled with tears. She found me? Jack frowned. You know her? Ethan nodded slowly, painfully. Years ago, I was working with a sanctuary up in Montana. There was a cub. We named her Luna. Poachers had killed her mother. I raised her for 2 years. She was too young to release at first, but eventually we got her back into the wild. Tagged her. Let her go. His voice broke. I never thought I'd see her again. Jack sat down heavily. She remembered you. Ethan nodded, eyes distant. I slipped down that ravine trying to photograph a wolf den. I was out for 2 days. I thought I was done. But I remember. I heard her. A low grunt. I looked up, and she was there right at the edge, watching. She didn't leave. Jack stared at the floor, mind spinning. In all his years in the field, he had seen many things. Bear cubs clinging to fallen trees, elk mourning their dead, wolves howling in the dark. But never had he seen something like this. A bear remembering a human, seeking him, saving him. It upended everything he thought he knew. The textbooks called it instinct, survival, territory. But this was something else. Compassion? Recognition? Love? Outside the hospital window, snow flurried gently in the late light, tracing ghostly lines through the trees. Jack rose and gripped Ethan's hand. You rest. When you're stronger, we'll talk more. As he turned to leave, Ethan called out, She saved me because once I saved her. Maybe animals don't forget kindness. Maybe they remember better than we do. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. The fire in his cabin crackled low as the storm rolled in, wind sighing through the eaves. He sat by the window, cup in hand, eyes fixed on the dark woods beyond. Somewhere out there, Luna moved through the forest she had claimed again, wild and free. And though she had no words, she had spoken louder than most ever could. And Jack listened. The weeks that followed unfolded like mist over pine needles, quiet, persistent, heavy with questions. Jack returned to his patrols, but the rhythm had changed. Each path he walked, each ridge he crested, bore the lingering presence of what he had witnessed. A bear, once raised by human hands, had remembered that bond and crossed the boundary of instinct to save the one who'd once saved her. It haunted him in the best and worst ways, stirring a reverence he hadn't felt since his early ranger days. Every rustle in the underbrush drew his eyes to the shadows. Every claw mark on tree bark made his breath catch. He hadn't seen Luna again, but she was there. He could feel it, watching, waiting, no longer a stranger in the woods, but a quiet guardian of something sacred. Ethan Cole, meanwhile, remained at the hospital, his recovery slow but steady. Word of his rescue spread quietly at first. Whispers among rangers, murmurs through town. But it wasn't long before the story caught fire. Local papers called it a miracle. Wildlife forums buzzed with speculation. A bear who remembered, who acted with what some dared to call empathy. Skeptics rolled their eyes, but others leaned closer to the tale, hungry for something true and strange and beautiful in a world too often dulled by cruelty. Jack kept most of it to himself. He wasn't one for dramatics. But when the doctors said Ethan was well enough for visitors, Jack returned, not just out of duty, but out of a gnawing curiosity that refused to quiet. Ethan was propped up in bed, his arms still in a sling, a laptop open in front of him, and his eyes red-rimmed from hours of scrolling through hundreds of photos. Looking for her, he said when Jack asked. I've got camera trap footage from a year ago. I think she's got cubs now. Jack raised an eyebrow. You're sure it's her? Ethan gave a tired smile. There's a scar on her right ear. She got it trying to climb a fence when she was a cub. I sewed it up myself. He paused. I was a wreck back then. 24, angry at the world, too stubborn to stay out of fights I couldn't win. But she calmed something in me. I thought I was saving her. Maybe she was saving me. Jack didn't reply, but he sat down in the chair beside the bed, nodding once. Ethan turned the screen toward him. Here, this was taken 6 weeks ago in the northern quadrant of the park. Same eyes, same walk, and those are definitely cubs. Jack studied the photo. The bear stood near a fallen cedar, 2 smaller shapes nestled at her side. Her eyes were clear, almost human. Luna. There was no doubt. Why were you in the ravine, what? Jack asked. Ethan leaned back, exhaling slowly. Tracking poacher signs. There have been strange patterns, motionless zones where bear populations that used to thrive, found baited scent trails leading toward private land bordering the park. Jack's expression hardened. Illegal hunting? Worse, Ethan said. Selective elimination. Someone's trying to clear predators from specific corridors. Why would anyone do that? Jack didn't need to ask. The park had long been eyed by developers, especially the northern ridges, rich with timber and mineral deposits. If bears and wolves disappeared, the land would be reclassified. Easier to sell, easier to exploit. He stood, tension knotting in his shoulders. We need to look into this. There's more, Ethan said. I kept a journal, recorded everything. Coordinates, camera tags, trail patterns. I gave a copy to Rachel. Jack turned. Rachel? My sister. We haven't talked in years, Ethan admitted. She's an environmental attorney now. I thought maybe if something happened to me, she'd know what to do. Jack nodded slowly. Smart. Ethan glanced toward the window. I think Luna knew. I think she saw something, maybe even who shot her. Jack stiffened. Shot? Ethan nodded grimly. She's limping in the footage. Front shoulder. I zoomed in. There's blood. Not from a fight, it's clean, like a grazing wound. She was hurt while protecting her cubs. Jack's mind whirled. A bear shot on protected land. A rescue that might not have been random. A man nearly dying at the edge of that same story. He knew what he had to do. 2 days later, Rachel Cole arrived in Evergreen in a dusty blue Subaru, her jaw set with the grim focus of someone used to fighting uphill battles. She was younger than Ethan by 5 years, but carried herself like a general in court-ready armor. Dark blazer, hiking boots, laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She and Ethan embraced awkwardly. The years of silence between them filled more with pain than malice. Jack watched from the side as the siblings spoke in hushed tones, then joined them as Rachel laid out the documents Ethan had sent her. There's a pattern here, she explained, her finger tracing a line across a map of the park. Each sighting he logged is near known logging stakes and mineral test plots, most of them owned by Northern Horizon Developments. Jack's eyes narrowed. They're not supposed to have access to this land. Not yet, Rachel said, but if the predators disappear, the legal barriers fall. Ethan spoke quietly. Luna's trying to survive in a war she doesn't even understand, and she still stopped to save me. Jack felt something shift deep in his chest. A thrum of anger, yes, but also awe. They would fight, not just for Ethan, not just for the law, but for Luna, for what she proved. Dr. Henry Malloy joined the team next, a gentle-voiced biologist from the Montana sanctuary where Luna had been raised. He brought research papers, behavioral data, and a look in his eyes that suggested he already knew what most people wouldn't believe. Bears remember when he said softly, we've always suspected. There's evidence of root memory, seasonal recall, even social ties. But Luna, she's something else. She's remembering a person, an emotion. Rachel nodded. That kind of memory challenges the very way we define wild. Over the next weeks, the group gathered footage, filed legal challenges, and contacted whistleblowers. Jack found old trail cameras hidden beneath ferns near logging sites, and in 2 separate cases, they recorded men in camouflage suits leaving out poison bait. Ethan's journal, paired with Luna's tracking collar data, painted a devastating map of disrupted bear territory. They submitted it all to the state commission. Public interest exploded when local news aired an interview with Jack and Ethan. Timid, reluctant, raw. But the real storm broke when Luna was spotted again. This time in daylight, limping but alive, her cubs trailing her like shadows. A live stream set up by wildlife rangers captured her emergence from the underbrush, her wounded gait unmistakable. The footage went viral. Millions watched as she turned toward the camera, nose lifted to the wind. The comments flooded in. She remembers. She came back. We must protect her. Jack stood beneath the pines that evening, the sky burning orange with sunset. Somewhere nearby, a bear moved through the shadows, not with fear, but with purpose. He thought of the old stories of animals that warned of fire, of wolves that mourned their dead, and now of a bear who remembered, who chose compassion. and who, despite her wounds, walked on. The forest no longer breathed in silence. It whispered, it stirred, it rallied. What began as a miracle in the shadows of the pines had grown into a movement, like roots cracking through concrete, slow, insistent, unstoppable. Luna's story had pierced the quiet soul of Evergreen, unearthing not just the bond between a man and a bear, but the fragile threads connecting all things wild and human. Jack Emerson stood before a crowd that filled the small amphitheater near the ranger station, the same one that once hosted sleepy summer talks about elk migrations and tree rings. Now it pulsed with the energy of hundreds, locals, hikers, students, ranchers, even strangers drawn by a story they didn't fully understand but deeply believed in. Jack adjusted the brim of his ranger's cap, cleared his throat, and let the silence settle over the crowd before speaking. A bear walked out of the woods and remembered a man. She led us to him. She didn't have to, but she did. And that tells me something we can't ignore. That something wild, something we've told ourselves is driven only by instinct, chose compassion. The words hung in the air, thick as pine resin. Behind him, Rachel Cole stepped forward with a legal folder clutched in her hand, her voice clear and sharp. We've filed suit against Northern Horizon Developments and several local officials involved in fast-tracking land deals in protected territory. This isn't just about one bear. It's about every bear, every wolf, every piece of wild land that can't defend itself with anything but silence. And we won't let that silence be used against them. The crowd stirred. Applause broke out. It wasn't a roar, not yet, but it was the beginning. Luna, still limping but healing, had been spotted days earlier near the Alder River, her cubs flanking her like dusk and dawn. Wildlife rangers tracked her cautiously, placing no pressure on her movement, but ensuring her collar continued to transmit vital data. And that data, once just a stream of numbers and blips, was telling a story too bold to ignore. Dr. Henry Malloy had set up a small mobile lab in the back of his SUV, poring over the GPS trail that mapped Luna's path since her rescue of Ethan. She's not just surviving, he told Jack one evening as rain tapped against the roof of the lab like fingertips on a drum. She's coordinating, moving between safe corridors, avoiding human settlements, sheltering her cubs in terrain we didn't even think they favored. He pointed to a cluster of points on the screen. And this? She backtracked after her injury, returned to one of the sites we suspect the poachers used. Jack leaned in. You think she was looking for something? Malloy's eyes were tired but alive with wonder. I think she's watching, learning, warning others maybe. We've observed wolves do it, crows, dolphins, but a bear? Jack said nothing, but deep inside he felt it, an ancient shiver of recognition, like the memory of a dream that hadn't yet faded. The local community, once wary of predators, began to shift. It started with small things, signs posted on trails to alert hikers of active bear territory, neighborhood discussions about trash storage and livestock protection. Then Ben Walker, a rugged outfitter who had once boasted of hunting wolves to protect his cattle, stood at a town meeting and held up a photograph. It was Luna, caught on his trail cam, standing tall against the slope of Copper Ridge, her eyes fixed on the lens. She could have taken my calf, Ben said, voice gruff but steady. She was close, but she didn't. She passed through, quiet, respectful. And that made me think. Maybe it's time we showed some respect too. A murmur swept through the room. Respect, not fear, not dominance. Something mutual, something new. From that spark, the Luna Network was born, a citizen science initiative that invited locals and visitors alike to report wildlife sightings, share trail conditions, and contribute to non-lethal wildlife management efforts. Drones were repurposed for monitoring rather than harassment. Trail cams were used to map movement patterns, not trap lines. Kids learned to track prints in the mud and upload them to a shared database, marveling at the paths that wove their town into the larger story of the park. Jack, though hesitant at first, found himself mentoring a group of high schoolers who had once considered the woods just a backdrop. Now they moved through it like apprentices, whispering to trees, asking questions with reverence. One afternoon, as they crossed a meadow where Luna had been seen nursing her cubs, one of the boys, Liam, stopped and crouched low. Look, he whispered, pointing to the muddy bank of a nearby stream. There, perfectly pressed into the earth, was the unmistakable print of a bear paw. Fresh. She was here, Liam breathed. Today. Jack knelt beside him, tracing the outline with a gloved finger. And she left it for us to find, as if to say, I'm still here. I see you too. Meanwhile, the legal battle deepened. Rachel faced opposition from all angles. Pressure from local officials who claimed she was disrupting the economy, threats from anonymous sources urging her to drop the case. But she pressed on. When documents leaked showing direct correspondence between Northern Horizon executives and two park commissioners, emails that detailed plans to remove high-risk predator species, public outrage ignited like dry tinder. Protesters gathered outside government buildings with signs that read, "She remembers, so do we," and "Protect the wild that protects us." Families came forward with stories of animals they'd encountered, foxes that returned each winter, owls that nested outside nurseries, a cougar that once shielded a child lost in the woods from coyotes. The lines between myth and science began to blur in the most beautiful ways. And then came the day Luna re-emerged fully. Her limp mostly gone, her coat thick and glinting with health, she appeared near a ranger camera at dawn. The live stream captured her stepping into a clearing, pausing, her cubs wrestling gently behind her. She stood there for nearly a full minute, staring at the lens, the early light catching in her eyes like fire caught in obsidian. Across the country, millions watched in silence. Children pressed to screens. Elders wept quietly. Scientists took notes, but not before sitting in awe. In that moment, Luna was not just a bear. She was a memory, a truth, a question and an answer. That night, the town gathered again, but this time not in anger or fear. Jack spoke only briefly, his voice softer than usual. She's not just part of this forest. She's part of us now. And we are part of her story. Then he stepped back, and the crowd lit candles, hundreds of tiny flames flickering like stars under the pine canopy. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Their silence said everything. And deep in the woods, a black bear paused on a ridge, ears flicking toward the light that danced beneath the trees. Her cubs pressed close, watching her. She did not run. She did not roar. She simply stood, still and proud, and watched the humans remembering what they had forgotten. That wildness does not mean savagery. That memory is not only for those who speak, and that in the heart of the forest a bear had chosen kindness once again. The collar released with a soft click just past dawn, falling gently from Luna's neck into the underbrush where frost still clung to the ferns. It was designed to detach after 1 year, quietly, without disruption. But the timing felt more poetic than planned. Somewhere behind her, nestled deeper into the mist-veiled forest, her cubs rustled beneath a pine. They had grown strong, no longer the fragile creatures who once trembled at her side, but confident shapes of muscle and curiosity, shaped by a year of freedom, a year of lessons. Luna stood still for a moment, feeling the absence of the collar like the lifting of a memory that had never been hers to carry. She sniffed the air, turning her head toward the mountain ridge, where the wind moved clean and sharp and wild. A nearby camera trap blinked, catching a single frame. The bear with the silver ear scar, lifting her head to the sky, unbound once again. In Clearwater, Jack Emerson watched that footage on his old desktop, a coffee gone cold in his hand and the morning light creeping across his office floor. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just breathed, deeply, slowly, and let the quiet settle into his bones like ash after a fire. He had spent 3 decades patrolling the edges of wildness, believing his duty was containment, guiding humans away from danger, pushing nature back into its lanes. But Luna had unraveled that belief, fiber by fiber, until only something softer remained. Respect, awe, responsibility. Across town, the Evergreen Wildlife Education Center opened its doors for the first time to the public. Where once there had been hesitation, even protest, now there was anticipation. Children spilled through the doors with wide eyes, greeted not by taxidermy or warnings, but by living stories. Interactive maps that tracked Luna's migration, digital exhibits showing bear family dynamics, short documentaries capturing Ethan Cole's recovery and return to the forest he nearly died in. In the center of the main hall stood a life-size sculpture of Luna, cast in black and bronze, her scar delicately carved, her cubs trailing behind her in a quiet procession. Beneath the sculpture were etched the words, "She remembered, so did we." Ethan stood just beyond the sculpture, a clean camera slung across his chest, his right arm, once broken, now fully healed, though a slight tremor remained when he lifted it for too long. But the tremor didn't bother him. It reminded him that his life had been caught and returned by something that had no reason to care for him except one: she remembered. He clicked photos with reverence, documenting visitors not as subjects but as participants in a growing story. Children pressing hands to the touchscreen, elderly hikers sharing trail encounters, rangers explaining how to read paw prints in the dirt. His sister, Rachel, walked the halls with calm purpose, clipboard tucked under her arm, dressed not in courtroom black, but in jeans and boots that bore the dirt of morning trails. The lawsuit had concluded weeks earlier, the judgment a victory that still rang like thunder through the state's legal landscape. Permanent habitat protections were enacted across 5 counties. Predator corridors were not only restored but expanded, with funding allocated for non-invasive monitoring. Officials involved in the poaching cover-ups faced indictment, and several developers withdrew entirely, citing public pressure and legal complications. But more than the win, it was the shift in tone that mattered most. Local ranchers partnered with researchers to test bear-safe fencing. High school students formed wilderness clubs that conducted wildlife observations and sent data to the Luna Network. Former skeptics like Ben Walker became speakers at conservation events, their voices carrying the weight of hard-earned change. Jack, though not one for public speaking, gave one final address at the town hall, standing quietly before a crowd larger than any he had ever seen. "You've heard the story," he said, "of how a bear remembered a man, but I think what matters more is that we remembered her, not as a curiosity, not as a threat, but as kin, as someone whose story deserves to continue." No applause followed his words, not right away, just silence, the good kind, the kind that listens, the kind that honors. And far from town, in the northernmost reach of the park, where the trees grew ancient and untouched, Luna crossed a stream with her cubs in tow. Their fur shimmered with youth and strength, their paws sure against the rocky earth. She led them not just toward food or shelter, but into deeper wildness where no collar could reach, where no threat lingered. And if a trail camera flickered nearby, she gave it no notice. Her part in the human world was done. She had taught them what they needed to know. A month later, Rachel received a letter, handwritten in the neat cursive of an older man who lived in the next county over. He was a retired trapper, once proud of his trade, but he'd seen the live stream and something had shifted. "I spent 40 years removing bears," the letter read. "I never thought to watch one protect. I didn't know they could choose to forgive. I didn't know they could remember." That line struck her the hardest. I didn't know they could remember. It wasn't just a bear who had changed things. It was the idea that wildness was not a blank slate of instinct, but a vast, mysterious landscape of memory, emotion, and choice. In her final media interview before stepping back from public life, Rachel said simply, "We learned from Luna. We learned that we are not the only ones who can choose to care." Meanwhile, Jack returned to his trails, not out of duty, but love. He wore no badge now, only a pack, and when hikers passed, they recognized him not as the ranger, but as the man who followed the bear. Sometimes they asked if he ever saw her again. He'd smile, shake his head, and point to the trees. "She doesn't need to be seen, just remembered." On his last hike of the season, he paused at a familiar ridge, the same one where Luna had once disappeared into the trees after showing him Ethan's broken body in the ravine below. The snow was thin now, just a lacework across the ferns. A single bear print marked the trail ahead. Not fresh, not new, but unmistakable. Jack crouched beside it, laid his hand in the hollow where Luna's paw had pressed into the earth, and for the first time in a long while, he whispered a thank you. Not for the miracle, not even for the man she saved, but for the reminder that memory lives where love once stood. That wildness is not absence of feeling, but the place where feeling begins again. That sometimes when the world forgets itself, it takes a bear to help it remember. Snow fell like memory over the ridges of evergreen, not in sheets but in slow, deliberate flurries that drifted through the air like pieces of something unfinished. It had been over a year since Luna had last been seen by human eyes, and though her image still adorned the signs at the Evergreen Wildlife Education Center and the children's storybooks lining the library shelves, she had returned fully to the forest, leaving only silence and awe in her wake. But silence was never empty. Not here. It was where roots whispered secrets, where water remembered paths cut 100 winters ago, where every snapped twig and startled squirrel echoed with the presence of something greater. For Jack Emerson, the forest had become not a place to manage, but a place to listen. His official retirement had come and gone without much fanfare. Just a handshake from the superintendent, a framed photograph, in a small gathering where Ethan, Rachel, and Dr. Var Malloy offered quiet words over coffee and pine nut cookies. But the truth was, Jack had never really left. He still walked the trails, still paused at the bends where the wind changed, where Luna had once stood. He no longer wore a uniform, but the forest seemed to recognize him just the same. Animals didn't scatter like they used to. A fox once followed him for an hour. An owl called from the same branch at dusk for 3 days straight. And though Luna herself had not reappeared, there were signs, paw prints in fresh snow, claw marks too high for any cub, strands of black fur caught on the bark of a cedar halfway up the mountain. The locals had stopped asking if she was still out there. They just said her name with a reverence usually reserved for ancestors. She had become part of the forest fabric, part story, part truth, entirely real. At the education center, Ethan continued his work documenting wildlife behavior. But he spent more time mentoring now, teaching young photographers how to see with patience rather than urgency. He told them that the best image was the one not taken, that the most honest encounters often happen just after the camera was lowered. His own photos of Luna remain unpublished in the traditional sense. Instead, he curated them into a small exhibition titled The Eyes That Remember, housed in a quiet corner of the center where visitors move slowly, whispering, often pausing for long stretches in front of a single image. Luna, standing in the falling snow, her cubs barely visible in the shadows behind her, her gaze locked on the lens with that same inexplicable familiarity. Ethan never captioned that one. It needed no words. Rachel had returned to her legal work, but everything she touched now carried the spirit of Evergreen. She took on cases that others deemed too emotional, too rooted in the soft sciences of ecology and animal behavior. She cited Luna in courtrooms, once even showing the live stream to a panel of judges debating whether to allow new drilling near a remote wildlife corridor. They had ruled against the project unanimously. But even victories like that were tempered by the vastness of what still remained at risk. She knew that Luna's story was rare not because animals lacked memory or compassion, but because humans rarely slowed down long enough to notice. Still, something had shifted. The Luna network had expanded statewide, then nationally. Wildlife sightings flowed in from hikers, ranchers, truckers, even children riding school buses. What started as a tool for observation had become something more, a web of connection that stretched like mycelium beneath the surface of society, binding people to the places they once ignored. And now there was news. A new bear had been spotted in the southern part of the park, a large female with a distinctive silver scar on her right ear and 2 cubs at her side, older than before, more independent. The footage, captured by a biologist named Maria Langston, showed the bear foraging calmly beside a stream, the cubs playing nearby. When Maria had uploaded the video to the Luna network, the response was immediate. Could it be? Was it really her? Jack had seen the clip only once, and he didn't question it. The tilt of her head, the rhythm of her stride. It was Luna, changed, older, but unmistakably herself, still leading, still watching, still here. And then, one late afternoon as the sun bled into the snow-dusted horizon, Jack returned to the ridge. He hadn't planned it, hadn't told anyone he was going. He brought no equipment, no radio, no phone, only his breath, his boots, and a small carved token in his coat pocket. A wooden bear shaped by a child from one of the local schools, gifted to him during a class visit to the education center. The wind was gentle that day, the kind that curled around your shoulders rather than pushed. The trees whispered above him, tall and old and kind. He reached the place, the very spot where Luna had once vanished into the trees after showing him where Ethan lay broken in the ravine. The snow was thinner here, patches of earth peeking through like the forest exhaling after holding its breath all winter. Jack sat down on a fallen log, placed the wooden bear beside him, and closed his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just waited. And in that stillness, something moved. Not loud, not urgent, just a shift in the air, a change in weight. Jack opened his eyes slowly. Across the clearing at the edge of the trees she stood. Luna. Her fur was thicker, dusted with gray along her haunches, but her posture was unchanged, calm, regal, present. Her cubs, nearly grown now, lingered behind her, half curious, half cautious. But she stepped forward once. Just once. Jack didn't rise. He didn't reach. He simply looked at her and nodded, his breath catching in his throat. "Thank you," he said, quietly, not expecting her to understand the words, but needing to say them anyway. Luna blinked slowly. Then she turned. Not rushed, not afraid, just ready. She disappeared into the trees like a story returning to its roots, and Jack remained, heart thundering with something that wasn't fear or joy, but a deep, abiding peace. A week later, the wooden bear was found by a trail maintenance crew, still perched on the log, untouched, as if guarding something sacred. They left it there. No one ever moved it again. Years passed. The education center grew. A research grant was established in Luna's name, funding long-term studies on bear cognition and emotional behavior. Laws changed. Hearts softened. A town once shaped by skepticism became a haven for stories like Luna's. And deep in the protected reaches of Evergreen, the bears lived on, wild, free, mysterious. But every so often, a hiker would return from the forest and say they felt something watching from the ridge, something calm and curious. They would speak of a black shape in the trees, a scar like a silver thread glinting in the light, and eyes that held memory like water holds the reflection of the sky. And those who knew, those who remembered, would smile and say, "That's her. That's the bear who remembered." Because in the end, it wasn't just Luna who had remembered. It was all of them. The ranger, the photographer, the sister, the town. The forest had kept the story safe until they were ready to listen. And when they finally did, it changed them. Forever.